So hello
Okay.
everyone, welcome and thank you for joining this webinar on adapting the graduation approach for programs that are targeting refugees. We'll just get started now. Just a few housekeeping rules. After the presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to the panelists, but you can start sending us some of your questions now via the web chat. Please also do send us your name as well as the name of the organization that you're representing. And just another housekeeping rule, please do kindly make sure that you're muted if you're not speaking. Today, joining us for this webinar, our speakers are Ziad Ayoubi from UNHCR, Janet Heisey from Trickle Up, and Sabrina Lustgarten from HIAS. My name is Melissa Victor, and I will be moderating this webinar today, along with my colleague, Aude de Montesquieu. Just a quick note about CGAP. CGAP is a global partnership of about 34 leading development organizations housed at the World Bank. Our mission is to improve the lives of the poor people by spurring innovations and advancing knowledge and solutions that promote responsible, sustainable, and inclusive financial markets. CGAP became involved in the graduation program as we realized that the standard microcredit programs were not reaching the extreme poor who needed a more contextualized and holistic intervention. In the mid-2000s, CGAP partnered with the Ford Foundation to explore how financial access to poorer and more vulnerable households could be, how to extend access to these poor and more vulnerable households that are not traditionally reached by microfinance. So in 2006, CGAP and the Ford Foundation started the CGAP Ford Foundation graduation program to test and adapt BRAC's targeting and the ultra-poor program, which is a carefully sequenced intervention. 10 pilots were launched in 8 countries, involving a broad range of partners, and an extensive research effort was launched to test the universality of the approach. The approach as we know it today is a time-bound interventions that are delivered at the household level for about 18 to 36 months. It deliberately targets the extreme poor, either those under the $1.90 per day line and or those that are identified as the poorest or most vulnerable and marginalized. It is holistic in order to tackle the multifaceted constraints of extreme poverty. It offers a big push based on the idea that a large investment to kickstart an economic activity will really make a meaningful change in the lives of those households that are participating in the program. It facilitates access to a wider range of social protection regime and formal or semi-formal financial services as a way to build resilience, to deepen economic inclusion, and to continue upward progress. Rigorous impact evaluations have shown that graduation reliably results in gains in income, consumption, food security, assets, and reported well-being for participating households. Today, what started as 10 pilots in 8 countries, we have reached about 60 second-generation graduation programs, which are now being implemented in about 37 countries. 1/3 of these are done by governments, typically as part of their national social protection strategies. Across the world, leading organizations and governments are exploring several permutations of the approach, most particularly innovations to adapt the approach to additional vulnerable segments such as extreme poor urban households, disadvantaged youth, people with disabilities, as well as refugees. It is estimated today that over 60 million people are affected by forced displacement worldwide, and a total of 125 people are currently affected by crises caused by disease, natural disasters, or conflict. These dire figures are creating an increasing financial strains on humanitarian actors that are operating in the field. Together with development actors, humanitarian organizations are exploring strategies that could help alleviate the economic and social hardships that are faced by many refugees and displaced persons. The graduation approach represents one such solution that helps refugees and displaced persons build their resilience and improve their economic opportunities. Today, we have the pleasure and opportunity to learn from three main organizations that have experience implementing programs that are targeting refugees. Please join me in welcoming our first panelist today, Ziad Ayoubi from UNHCR. Ziad has a Master's of Science degree in Sociology and Socioeconomic Development. He has been working on local economic development since 2002. He worked in microfinance, micro and small and medium enterprises development, as well as early recovery and development. He joined UNHCR in 2012, and since then, he has been managing economic inclusion programs targeting refugees. He's leading the rollout of the Global Strategy for Livelihoods from 2014 until 2018. Ziad, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. As Melissa said, I'm going to speak on behalf of UNHCR to explain the background, the rationale of the adoption of the graduation approach for refugees. Before starting and explaining how we did that and in partnership with whom and how was the process, maybe let me give few figures. I'm not going to give long time for that because I think we all know the magnitude of the situation of the refugee crisis in the world. So let me start by the next slide, please. The number of forcibly displaced persons worldwide has been rising continuously in recent years. As we speak now, there are more than 65 million individuals that were driven from their homes as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. 21 million are refugees, 40 million are internally displaced, around 3 million are asylum seekers. While new conflicts erupt, existing conflicts linger and root causes of forced displacement show no signs of being addressed. So this means that the scale and complexity of the challenge of responding to the needs of refugees and other displaced people for protection and assistance have increased as displacement persists over time. Prolonged periods of displacement, often for more than a generation, have a devastating impact on the lives of people and result in grave losses of human potential. So taking all this into consideration, I think there is a global understanding that there is a need to start doing things differently, and there is a need for out-of-the-box approaches. These approaches are relevant to all types of interventions in the humanitarian fora. This includes assistance, it includes protection, the solutions aspect, and most specifically relevant to this topic that we are discussing today, the need to find ways to do economic inclusion for refugees is becoming more and more important and bigger. The economic inclusion of refugees, regardless the solution that is usually politically binded in the country of asylum, the economic inclusion is not 100% related to one solution. It is a way to achieve dignity for people. It's a way to improve livelihoods of people, regardless what is the solution. It is one of the vehicles towards solutions. It can help in local integration, but also it helps in voluntary repatriation and in resettlement to third countries. So the need for economic inclusion is there regardless the political situation and the solutions situation. In order to achieve economic inclusion, we think that there is a major need also to adopt market-based approaches. So we all agree that the old ways of programming for livelihoods are somehow outdated now. There is a need to look at markets, to make the market systems work for refugees as we are trying to make it work for poor people. So we are putting refugees in the same category of any other national who need the market system to be working for them. So this market approach is being adopted by UNHCR. We've been applying market-oriented programming since 2013. However, there was always a question around what about the extreme poor. There was always a concern that market approaches and market systems might be exclusive for those who have a certain viability, and those who are in the bottom of the pyramid might be excluded from these programs and systems. So this is where UNHCR in 2013 decided to discuss with other partners how can we mitigate this challenge, and we decided to adopt the graduation approach starting 2013, 2014. And next slide, please. And we found that the graduation approach is highly relevant to the need of refugees. There are at least three reasons why the relevance is so high. First of all, as you will see in the next presentations and in what Melissa said, there is a consumption support component in the graduation approach. This is where targeted persons need to be receiving a certain type of basic needs support. And in refugee situations, UNHCR and other partners are working on providing protection support that includes humanitarian assistance that is usually classified as a consumption support. So in refugee situations, there is no need to establish a new component rather than using the existing available services provided to refugees. The consumption support could be cash, unconditional cash, it could be food assistance, it could be education and health support. This is already there. It is provided by humanitarian organizations, and we found it very relevant to bring the graduation approach to top up this first component with the other 3-4 components that will be explained by my colleagues. The protection and case management nature of the graduation approach is something also that UNHCR and humanitarian partners master usually. So we do case management for protection purposes. We are in close contact, whether it's us or our NGO partners. We are in close contact with the persons of concern, and we use the case management in non-livelihood settings, and we found that it's very relevant to use the case management for livelihoods purposes, and this is where it became very relevant to adopt the graduation approach. The last relevance point is the level of flexibility and to which extent we were able to adapt the graduation to the contextual needs. In some places, we piloted the graduation where there's no way for local integration. So the purpose of the graduation was to enhance living conditions and level of income and expenditures. In other places, we managed to use the graduation even in directions of local integration in all sense, including the legal sense, where people were supported in order to get naturalized in the country of asylum. Next, please. So in terms of the adoption process, where do we stand now? We've decided to work with a partner who knows the topic. So for us, it was obvious that Trickle Up is the NGO that can support an organization like UNHCR in adopting in adopting the graduation approach. So we've started this partnership in 2013 with Trickle Up, and since then we are supporting country operations who have the essential components of the graduation to adopt this approach and to start targeting ultra-poor refugees. We've done this so far in 5 countries. 3 of them are a little bit more advanced than the others. We have 2 less advanced, and we have a plan to expand to at least or to around 5 operations in 2017. Next, please. We have some challenges, and to list few of them, there is a perception inside and outside UNHCR that around graduation scalability. So some opinions say that the graduation cannot be scaled up because it's very much heavy on case management and it is very individualized. So in partnership with research institutes, with our partners, including Trickle Up, we're trying to explore how to respond to these perceptions. And we're using research, and we're building the evidence base in order to check the scalability, the cost, and the impact of the graduation program and approach. Another challenge is the availability of data. As you know, in order to apply the graduation approach, you need to know who is the poor category in the population. So it's very essential to know, to have poverty data, and in refugee situations. Can I ask everybody to mute, please, because there is some noise around the presentation. So the availability of data is an issue sometimes in refugee operations. UNHCR usually manage refugee data through registration, through other verification processes. However, poverty data is not always available, and this is what's delaying the adoption of the graduation in some operations. So there is a step that needs to be taken, a prerequisite step, which is the collection of the poverty data and the analysis of the data and the wealth ranking. Finally, graduation doesn't help if there is no market opportunities and there is no viability in the markets. This means that we are being challenged sometimes where graduation is being adopted because the market's absorption capacity is limited. So this is where we're trying to work with development actors in order to make sure that the graduation approach goes hand in hand with local economic development. Next, please. So where are we heading now? What is the plan for UNHCR in terms of the graduation approach for refugees? In line with the New York Declaration 2016 and the Global Compact for Refugees 2018, UNHCR is working with development actors, with other actors like the private sector and governments, in order to make sure that refugees are being included in economies. And this should be translated on the ground into programmatic inclusion. So this means that we are working with partners to make sure that refugees, regardless UNHCR programming, are part of available systems, available services and programs. This includes organizations like microfinance institutions, banks. It includes also working with social protection schemes, poverty alleviation, SMEs development, and all that. In terms of graduation, we are also working with graduation agencies. So agencies who are applying the graduation, we're working with them in order to include refugees in their programs. We have some success in this area. We have some attempts, and a lot is waiting for us. So first of all, maybe the first example is Uganda, where the USAID and the Food for Peace decided to develop a program for refugees, $33 million, targeting refugees, and this is not humanitarian money. So this is where it is a breakthrough to see development actors, including refugees, in their programming. Lebanon also, we are discussing with the World Bank in order to make sure that, in order to explore the feasibility of applying the graduation approach on refugees. The same in Costa Rica, we worked with the government in order to expand the graduation approach that we introduced in the country to become a national social protection scheme. What's needed now is to build the evidence in order to convince more organizations to include refugees in their programming. UNHCR doesn't want to be the implementer of the graduation in the future. The way we see it happening, we see refugees being part of national programs, of social protection schemes, and UNHCR will always play the role of convener, facilitator, and advisor, because we know our population and we want to be having an essential role in economic inclusion for refugees, but not the lead role. So this is where we're heading now. Thanks to our partners, we are achieving some success, and hopefully through this webinar, we will be able to raise more awareness in terms of graduation for refugees. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ziad, for this presentation. We will now turn to Janet Heisey from TrickleUp. Janet Heisey is TrickleUp's Director of Technical and Strategic Alliances, where she leads TrickleUp's partnership with UNHCR. Janet crafted the Joint Graduation and Refugees Initiative, which seeks to establish graduation projects in 22 UNHCR countries by 2018, and has provided guidance and technical support to the 6 graduation projects established by UNHCR to date. Mrs. Heisey provides capacity building support to colleagues in West Africa, India, and Central America to effectively implement technical assistance engagements. Previously, she oversaw TrickleUp's CGAP Ford Foundation graduation projects in India and its subsequent scale-up. Janet, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm happy to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about the Graduation and Refugees Initiative, but just a quick word on who is TrickleUp. TrickleUp is an organization that was founded in 1979, and really since that time, we've always had a focus on people who are living in extreme poverty, especially vulnerable populations. So always interested in focusing on indigenous populations, people with disabilities, and of course, quite recently, with refugee populations. And we've always been looking for economic solutions for that particular population. And in the last 10 years, as Melissa mentioned, those initial pilot programs through the CGAP and Ford Foundation initiative, TrickleUp was one of those pilot projects. And since that time, we've really been focusing on integrating lessons from graduation in all of our regional operations. So that includes in West Africa, in our Burkina Faso office, in Central America, in Guatemala, headed by our Guatemala team, and then in India as well. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense about what this Graduation and Refugees Initiative looks like, really, we've got one overarching objective, which is to increase the number of refugees and host country participants who are graduating to self-reliance. So we really are looking to reach as many people as we can with effective graduation strategies. And we are looking by the end of next year to be implementing the graduation approach in 22 countries. So a relatively ambitious goal, but we're pretty convinced we can get there, and we hope to do so in a couple of different ways. one of which is to build our own capacity and that of our UNHCR colleagues to deliver good, strong graduation programs in their particular countries of focus. And that's sort of building on the strengths of the graduation initiative thus far, or the work that we've done, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we're also really looking, as Ziad mentioned, to engage other partners in this work. So really looking at perhaps other graduation implementers who are interested in integrating refugees in their program and providing them support, and humanitarian actors who might already be engaged in work with refugees and thinking about how we can support their integration of some of the lessons learned from graduation into what it is that they're doing. And so if we look at the next slide, the global footprint that we've got so far is off to a good start. So we've got 4 countries, 3 of which, as Ziad mentioned, are pretty advanced. That's Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Egypt, all of which have really taken lessons of graduation and worked towards scale, and a project in Burkina Faso as well that is getting underway. And together, those represent about 6,200 participants that have been targeted thus far. We have 2 programs in Zambia and Zimbabwe that are in the final stages of the planning process, and we're trying to create this pipeline of new countries by making sure that some of the basic requirements for getting a good livelihoods and graduation program on board are getting in place in each of these countries. So it's through these efforts that we hope to be able to scale over the next year, 2 years in fact. And if we look at the next slide, what we've been trying to do with the Graduation and Refugees Initiative is really understand how does graduation work in all of the different contexts within which refugees live and UNHCR works. So importantly, this has represented a strong sort of focus on urban populations. 50% of refugees live in urban areas, or more than 50% in fact, so that was a critical area for us to come to understand. And so we've started some of the earliest work in urban areas, really trying to understand what needs to vary, what are the lessons learned, and what kind of variations do we need to have on the model in order to be effective. And obviously working in rural settings and camp settings as well. We've really looked at strengthening the capacities, really making ourselves collectively, the global community, more effective at utilizing graduation lessons for targeting these populations. And UNHCR, like TrickleUp, in fact, doesn't work directly typically in the field on livelihood projects. We work with local implementing partner organizations. So really trying to understand how can we strengthen the capacity of a humanitarian organization, which may have particular strengths in the coaching or the case management component. How do we strengthen their capacities on the economic development side? And for economic development actors, how can we strengthen their coaching and case management strategies and skills in order to sort of have this nice combined approach that Ziad mentioned, where you get both the strengths of a humanitarian approach and an economic development approach in the graduation project. And really what we're trying to do through these pilot programs with UNHCR is to help the operation and the partners engaged to really sequence and streamline service delivery. So as Ziad mentioned, a lot of the components of graduation already exist in a UNHCR operation. And so the task is to try and figure out how to combine those in a very deliberate kind of sequence, how to make those time-bound to ensure that people are sort of moving up this ladder of progress, receiving the support they need to engage effectively in economic activities, while also moving towards greater self-reliance and independence. So if we look at the next slide, this sort of outlines a little bit of what the graduation strategy looks like in a UNHCR context. We saw the first slide, we saw the earlier slide from Melissa, which focused on the typical UNHCR, or excuse me, traditional sort of CGAP graduation strategy. And we've taken that strategy and added a couple of bells and whistles, which relate specifically to the refugee population. So here the graduation components in yellow are kind of the traditional ones. And you can see which ones start at the beginning of the intervention and which start a little bit later on. But there are a couple of new ones that we launched. If we look at number 2, down there on the bottom, network engagement, we made that a separate component. And the reason is the third component, savings, in a TrickleUp context is very often savings and credit groups. And savings and credit groups have a financial goal and a financial means, And then they also have a social capital building goal, right, where people are meeting on a weekly basis and building relationships with one another. But when we moved into an urban context, we found that, well, sometimes refugees are able to save in bank accounts. And so we get a great, strong financial product, but we don't necessarily have that engagement with networks or building of social capital that we would otherwise see in a savings group. So we wanted to be sure that given that isolation is such a critical challenge for refugee populations, we wanted to be super deliberate about making this a separate component and ensuring that our program design takes that into account. So it'll vary by context, but it could be a whole range of different options for different participants. In some cases, it may be a savings group, or it could be a sporting activity, or it could be a group that are gathering who have the same economic activity, for instance. But just to be sure that that's a key and critical part of the process. If you look up to number 7 and 8, down up at the top there, that's one of the other key distinctions here, is that with the traditional graduation project in rural areas, it's typically been self-employment. That has been the option. That's typically the primary option that we're pursuing. But in an urban context, wage employment is actually an alternative. So we wanted to be deliberate about separating those out, understanding what are the specific training, technical skills that are required, and also what kinds of support, either by way of asset transfer or other kinds of job support, are required to make sure that participants in the program can really thrive. So if we look at the next slide, just wanted to share a couple of the lessons learned along the way. Having worked in these sort of typically rural contexts where we've been implementing graduation, there were a couple of highlights that stood out to me, things that are unique about the graduation, the refugee context from our perspective. One of which is, especially when you're working in urban areas, this is a highly mobile population. And refugee populations are interspersed throughout the urban area. They are not huddled in one particular area, making some challenges for how it is that we select and then how we work with that particular population. And when I say highly mobile, very highly mobile, which means when people are coming and arriving, particularly people from rural areas, maybe coming to urban areas for the first time, having to find housing, that challenge to really overcome xenophobia, lack of information, fear, etc., in order to even just find an apartment to rent can be a big challenge. And so in the early stages of your program design, that obviously plays a role, and that's an important consideration when you're thinking about how this program can work and how your program can be modified to meet their needs. So selection, as I mentioned, is a challenge. Group-based activities can be a challenge, and really this can impact your coaching, the number of coaches required, the frequency of coaching visits, and the type of coaching visits. But it's possible in some cases technology can help alleviate or overcome some of those challenges by enabling people to connect with coaches even between a typical household visit. So the next lesson learned really was something that Ziad referred to, which is, look, a lot of these components of graduation already exist in an operation, in a local operation where UNHCR and refugees are working. And so that provides some particular advantages. You know, in those rural programs, we were always struggling to figure out how are we going to link people to health services when the government isn't providing them in this area, et cetera. Well, UNHCR and partners are very often providing some of these services very effectively. And so that fact alleviates some of the stress on the organization, but it kind of changes the nature of the program. So you really have to have a different view when thinking about training and advocacy and what kind of partnerships you form. But I think quite importantly, it impacts the coaching again. Who are your coaches and how do you have to prepare them for implementation? In this kind of context, the coaches don't need quite as much expertise in a lot of different areas. Rather, they are going to be much more geared up for referring to different services within the area. So that means education levels and certainly training can and should be different. And finally, one of the things that occurred to me as we were looking at the graduation program, the next slide will show, is that the legal status and the right to work is really, that was a preoccupation for me. How are we going to work on economic development when this legal status is in question at times where refugees may not have the legal right to work? And really what we found is, the refugees, when we visit them, they are working on the margins of informal markets as it stands. They are working because they have to be engaged. They have to be working in these areas in order to survive. And so the best thing to do is engage them as effectively as possible in those informal markets, provide information and resources to enable them to take better advantage of those opportunities that exist, provide some training on their rights, and then ensure that coaching is really enabling them to strengthen that activity and perhaps find a more stable activity or balance that with other opportunities in the household. So the idea is to emerge at the end with a much stronger livelihood strategy, which involves a number of different activities. So it's been an extraordinary opportunity to learn about a variety of different contexts, particularly the urban context. But you'll hear much more from my colleagues at HIAS about what that looks like in the Ecuador context. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Now we would turn to our colleague from HIAS, Sabrina Lustgarten. Sabrina is a strong advocate for refugee rights and has actively worked with the Jewish community in Ecuador, involving herself in various community affairs. Previously, she held the position of Executive Director of the Jewish community between 1998 and 2002. Since HIAS Ecuador's program for Colombian refugees and asylum seekers began in 2003, which was done in partnership with UNHCR, she led the first program of psychosocial support for refugees in the country, as well as the program for economic integration. These programs stand out as pioneer on advocacy for refugee rights, and because of important results such as the setting of specialized job banks for refugees with the support of public and private institutions, including the Ministry of Work. Furthermore, as part of her advocacy work, Sabrina also participated in events to follow up the Brazil Action Plan, which promotes a protection system for refugees at a regional level. She holds an MA in Social Development from the Simón Bolívar University in Quito, Ecuador. Sabrina, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. We are very pleased to contribute in this webinar. And as a complementary to the former presentation, we would like to talk about the field experiences and lessons during the implementation of the graduation model in Ecuador. Next, please. Next, please. So this is the organization. This is my organization. Only to say that HIAS work in Ecuador, 15 years already, as partner of UNHCR, running the programs for refugees, including psychosocial care and mental health, and livelihood and economic development. Next, please. Ecuador is the country that welcomes most of the refugees in Latin America. 87% of them are Colombian, and currently more than 400 people entered to the country in search of international protection monthly. In 2016, HIAS Ecuador have assisted more than 12,000 people of concern through all the programs in 9 cities all over the country. Next, please. Next, please. Melissa? Next, please. Thank you very much. In Ecuador, we have developed the graduation model approach as a case management model, which implies the joint work of all the HIAS areas to support the family with the objective of achieving sustainable livelihoods. The case management approach includes the monitoring every 15 days by mentors in order to evaluate how the families progress and meet their needs, with the aim to accomplish achievable goals in a limited time. This includes aspects of health, education, documentation, and access to services. Some consumption support is provided according to the size of the family during the year, including food assistance with the support of World Food Program and food vouchers and training on nutrition. This allows families stability to meet their commitments and scale towards economic independence, Additionally, support via UNHCR is provided by cash-based intervention. Community resource staff work in the community to facilitate integration and community networks. In parallel, while working on these aspects, the livelihood staff conduct a profile scan that will strengthen the household capacities, and depending on their profile, they will receive continuous orientation on wage employment and self-employment, including seed capital and vocational training. It is important to emphasize at this moment that this process is accompanied by financial education and promotion of savings. Due to the emotional situation, some families require individual and family psychosocial support. This is an essential accompaniment to support them in their process to overcome the effects of violence and shocks in order to progress toward graduation. The families also receive legal orientation on their rights and documentation procedures. Those cases which need specialized legal assistance are referred to other partners. Next, please. Next, please. Thank you. We started with a pilot in Santo Domingo, officially in January 2015. With UNHCR, we developed this pilot with 200 families that includes in this moment refugee families and Ecuadorian families. It is important to note that the first pilot only includes a minimum consumption support, referrals to public services according to their needs. The families have to develop their livelihoods on the basis of vocational training and grants for entrepreneurship. Some families did not finish the entire 2 years for several reasons, including resettlement, return to Colombia, or move to other cities. After an average of 8 months within the graduation model approach, however, they achieved 3 or 4 graduation goals, which shows that they have gained livelihood tools to integrate in their new context. The complete process has taken 2 years, and midterm and final evaluation have been conducted in coordination with UNHCR to assess the impact for the participants. In general, we have observed that the majority of families overcame extreme poverty and are in better conditions. This pilot allowed us to develop necessary tools for national process. Next, please. Based on the result from the graduation model pilot, UNHCR in coordination with HIAS decided to scale up the graduation model approach at a national scale. And we begin this on April 2016. The national scale-up meetings with UNHCR since the beginning of the program have been one of the most important tools which have let us monitor and improve the implementation. These meetings are conducted regularly until now. This has resulted in the development of an infrastructure to get the graduation criteria, including the agreement on the targeting criteria, standardization of graduation criteria, and monitoring tools. Likewise, issues that arise during the process are resolved, and training for the field team is defined, thanks to the support of UNHCR, TrickleUp, and HIAS. It is important to mention joint works for advocacy with governmental and private institutions. This is the case of the synergic work with Banco Pichincha, the largest bank in the country, which has resulted in the access of refugee population to bank accounts. We can also mention advocacy with ministries and other public institutions to foster refugee rights. Next, please. Some of the action in the scaling up process of the graduation model approach implies the improvement of tools to implement the program. HIAS strengthened the database system for the record and management of the case information, which allows us to keep the monitoring information updated and the follow-up of the cases. Besides, constant training to the field teams on different topics has been conducted, as well as the creation of internal standardized procedures for case management. The community works allow us to support cases that do not reach our offices and also create networks of support within the communities. Advocacy work and training has been strengthened with community organizations, state institutions, local governments, ministries, and private sector. This work will allow us to pass capacity on the government, including awareness of the specificity of the work with the refugee population so that they are integrated into their national programs. Next, please. Some challenge in field implementation, including and in addition of the ones that Janet told us before, are the long processes to obtain the refugee status. In that sense, HIAS works providing legal orientation and referral to implementing partners and governmental agencies. Another situation is the discrimination that HIAS work very hard, strengthening the community work, doing workshops at schools, workshops with governmental institutions, and integration fairs. In relation to the economic context, including the consequences of the earthquake, HIAS has worked on the orientation to diversification the income resources, local market assessments, and advocacy with public and private sector to foster employment for refugees, and facilitating the formalization of business. Regarding access to services, only to note that in relation to financial services, we have worked with UNHCR to include asylum seekers in these programs, and advocacy meetings with private sector and governmental agencies have been held. We have included here the challenge of the extracontinental cases as a challenge since they are arriving increasingly, and the range of needs goes from language to specific cultural access. Next, please. The design of the graduation model approach has focused on the specificity of the refugee population and their needs, taking in account the psychosocial, the psychological, the economic, and social characteristics that are affected by the displacement. Another of the lessons learned is the importance of the clarity of the message transmitted to the families in terms of the graduation criteria, process timing, follow-up conditions, as well as the fulfillment of the agreement, since this program has a beginning and an end. The comprehensive work from all the areas are the mainstreaming of psychosocial support have made a difference in the progress of the families. The positive outcome that we have observed after working with private institutions for mutual benefit will result in the continuation of our work in this field. Next, please. We present now two examples of in the next slides with very high level of vulnerability and how through the graduation model they have significantly changed their living condition, obtain a sustainable livelihood that allows them to meet their family needs. The first family arrived in Ecuador in 2011, but could not improve their situation until they were within the graduation model approach pilot. This case is from the pilot. In this case, HIAS mentors conducted constant monitoring every 15 days, and a comprehensive work was developed from all areas. They received orientation and support to meet their basic needs, psychological support, and accompaniment from the development of a business plan that allowed them to establish a business of production and sale of wafers. They even generate work for local populations. Next, please. Melissa, next, please. Uh-oh. Melissa, next, please. Maybe there is some situation. No. Okay, the previous one, please. So maybe we continue. So previous, so maybe one previous, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. This is the case of Tatiana. She arrived in Guayaquil, Ecuador on February 2016 with 4 children. She is woman alone. They are currently asylum seekers. Here you can see the initial characteristics when we found the family. In this case, similarly, the mentors conducted monitoring every 15 days. They received consumption support, training on entrepreneurship, and a specific business plan was developed for her profile. In addition, she received orientation for the access to education for the children, and psychological support was provided since she was a survivor of torture. Next, please. Okay, here we have some numbers. In 2016, we targeted 1,500 families, and we continue in the monitoring process. And now in 2017, we are working now with, we have the target of 600 families for this year. Next, please. Currently, we have 4 graduation criteria to measure the progress of families. It is important to note that the families have entered the process in different months, and the figures show in the progress in each goal accordingly. Therefore, a family graduates when they meet the 4 criteria after a period of 8 months. 18 months, sorry, 18 months. So thank you very much. Next, please.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to all the previous panelists for these excellent presentations. We will now be taking some questions from our guests in the webinar. To get us started, there is one question from Allison. I'm not sure if she wants to quickly ask herself, but I'll just quickly ask on her behalf. So she had 2 questions, one for Janet and one for Ziad. The first question is, how is legal status or right to work not a barrier to participation? If this is not an urban context but a camp-based context, what are the viable options for the refugees, say if agriculture is not at all an option? So this would be for Janet. I repeat, how is the legal status or right to work not a barrier to participation? If this is not an urban, if it is an urban context, if it is not an urban context, but rather a camp-based context, what are the viable options for the refugees?
Okay, thanks for the question. We've sort of been addressing it too. You can scroll in the chat box to see a few of the other responses as well regarding the legal context. And it's not to say by any stretch of the imagination that it can't be a consideration and it can't be a barrier in certain cases. In the camp situations in which we've worked and or rural settlements in which we've worked, the right to work has not been an issue. So in actual fact, we haven't in a camp setting confronted a situation where there is a strong bar on right to work. So that continues to be a strategy. Again, it's important to note that the graduation approach is one approach for livelihood development. UNHCR and other partners have other strategies for working with different populations. When working with the extreme poor, it can be a meaningful and viable strategy, but it's not necessarily going to work in all contexts. So we are continuing to learn about the situations in which it does work and what some of the barriers are and if there are ways around those barriers. It's a work in progress.
Thank you, Janet. We have a follow-up question for Ziad. If governments are not willing to move toward local integration, is economic integration still possible? Follow-up, how has UNHCR succeeded in convincing national governments to include refugees in social protection schemes that include transfers, remembering that refugees are not citizens of that country?
Okay. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the question. So the first part, if there is no integration, is economic inclusion possible? And I repeat, I underline the inclusion and not integration, because the language matters here. I think yes, and there is evidence for that, and there are examples. The example of Jordan. Jordan politically is not open for any discussion related to integration. So it's not so far, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but so far the government of Jordan is not willing to integrate Syrian refugees in the country. However, the government of Jordan committed to granting 300,000 work permits in order to achieve economic inclusion of refugees in the country. This was a bargain that happened as part of the London conference. So there were some conditions put by the government of Jordan. Most of these conditions are well understood, valid conditions. So I think there is a possibility for the international community to work with host countries in order to achieve economic inclusion without achieving local integration, because the political context doesn't allow. The second question, the integration in social protection. This is more tricky. Usually, even in the case of Jordan and even in other cases, governments are open for economic inclusion. However, the most important conditions in these deals that are happening nowadays is that the taxpayers' money in the host country is not affected. So because already the host country is bearing a lot of burden, and as part of the burden sharing principle, the international community is usually asked to contribute. So usually including refugees in social protection schemes at the national level comes as a package, and usually the international community contributes financially to this inclusion. Is this sustainable? Maybe we can think that this is not 100% sustainable because it's not embedded in the public budget. However, financing coming from the World Bank and from multinational financial institutions can be a very good first step, and then at the long run, depending on how the situation develops, sustainability could be achieved. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Ziad. Do any of the other panelists would like to maybe add a few other perspectives on that question? Right, we have one question which I'm not sure was answered in the web chat, which was from Dale, addressed to Janet. You mentioned that the right to work is not part of the graduation criteria. Could you perhaps explain or extrapolate a bit more about the graduation criteria in that context?
Sure. Thank you, Dale, for your question. So graduation criteria is going to be contextual. It's going to depend upon what's the condition of the extreme poor refugees in the country in which you work, and what's a reasonable or viable outcome for those various different refugees in that particular context. But typically, we're looking for change in a number of different areas, and not surprisingly, these relate directly to the kinds of support that we're providing. So we talked a lot about network building. We talked about, this sense of trying to reduce this sense of isolation. So very often there might be some sort of means of gauging people's engagement or their understanding about the services that they are able to access and the actual practice of accessing some of those services. We obviously are looking for financial indicators. So we're looking for increased income, increased assets, changes in savings behaviors, and setting some clear targets there where we can, and then testing those targets to make sure that those are appropriate and attainable by the population. So you start with some working assumptions around your graduation criteria, and then you assess and modify as required. Obviously, we're looking to build skills if that is seen to be a particular gap in a population. We want these skills to travel with them if and when they make choices about where it is that they're continuing to live, and so changes in those sort of skills and abilities and knowledge is another one of those areas. And the reason, I trust it's clear why we don't sort of include legal criteria. We don't include those as graduation criteria. They're typically outside the scope of what a participant can achieve on his or her own, right? These are things that are external. So we certainly encourage and track how people are following the necessary steps to strengthen their legal status within the country and pursue visas as required, whatever the requirements are. But we wouldn't make that a graduation criteria because ultimately they have no control in what final decision is taken.
Thank you.
Yes, here, Sabrina. Maybe I have one additional comment that I saw in the questions about the graduation criteria that is important. Here said that maybe it includes the food security, the savings. So in Ecuador, I wanted to say that we have the following graduation criteria. We have families eating 3 times a day adequately for 6 months, family savings at least 5% for 6 months, families participating in community activities in an active and sustained ways for 6 months, and families with monthly income at least $80,000 per capita for 6 months. 82. Sorry for this. 82 per capita. So this is the 4, because I saw here a comment in the WebEx, so I am, here are the criteria included.
Thank you, Sabrina. And quickly, one question from the web chat is from Mark Ekiru. His question is, just in case of a fallback after graduation due to a shock or stress, are there mechanisms that are made to support and protect some of these refugees? This question is for all 3 panelists.
Maybe I can start answering. There was a discussion around the term graduation, actually, the use of the title graduation, and there was there was a concern around people slipping back into high vulnerability, high poverty, and destitution after graduating out of the poverty, and what would be the situation in this case. I think the short answer is that basic needs assistance provided by UNHCR and partners is definitely non-sustainable, shrinking, facing some budget cuts and all that. However, we always try to keep a minimum amount of support that should be given to protection cases to those who are living in destitution. So definitely, in an ideal world, we want to see people graduating out of poverty and not coming back to poverty, and not claiming, not requesting further support, living in dignity. However, this is not the case everywhere and all the time. And at least from UNHCR point of view, we don't, apology for using this word, but we don't blacklist those who graduate of of the poverty due to engaging in the graduation approach, so they cannot get into the support anymore. This is not the case. And this is what we called in one of the discussions, actually, a responsible way of implementing the graduation program. Thank you.
I'll just add to that very quickly, and then obviously some really specific examples from Ecuador would be fab, but the graduation word is indeed tricky. I think anybody in the community will agree. I think one way to think about this is we are graduating people into certain levels of exposure, support, etc. So a big part of what we're trying to do in the graduation approach is to share resources and ensure that connections are made with systems and organizations and institutions that can be helpful to refugees even after the project ends. So there is a very clear time limit within which we're hoping to see these changes, by which time they should absolutely be able to access highest services and other services of local partner organizations. That becomes one of their critical links. Government services that exist, they should hopefully be accessing. Financial services that they've had an opportunity to test and utilize during the graduation project will, we hope, and we try and design, be available to refugees after that period of time. But as Ziad says, we understand this is a fluid situation, and happily, because of the level of support that exists and the kinds of institutions that are often present, that sort of safety net remains available.
Yes. What we do in the point of view of HIAS, all of these programs is strengthening, empowering the families so they can know the rights, they can know where to go to access to services, they know all the information of the financial services, where they can go, and the other partners, the governmental partners. So part of the progress and the process that we do with the mentors is, since the beginning, is to empower the families to do that. So this is one of the things. The other thing is one of the criteria that we have for the graduation model, and it's the savings. We really are trying hard to meet this criteria. That is not easy, I have to say, but with this criteria, they will have like a tool to go against this kind of shocks that they can have after the finishing of the graduation model approach. So we, since the beginning, work on that level. So I think that we are not finishing. We are now working in the graduation since the family started in 2016. But this is the work that we do here in the field. Try to empower these families.
Thank you all for these. There is one quick question here from the web chat from Ode. It's specifically for Ziad. Do you include host communities in graduation programs? And if yes, how do you do so?
Okay, so I want to go back a little bit to what I mentioned at the beginning. What we want to see is to see programs implemented by other agencies targeting national people and including refugees, because refugees are a minority of the habitants, and it should be targeting mainly national habitants and refugees as part of it. Where it's not possible to see that, UNHCR sometimes implement programs. And this is where Trickle Up mentioned the 3 countries, then the 5 countries, and then the expansion that's happening. And definitely in these cases, nationals and host communities are targeted. In some places, it is challenging. It's not an easy thing, especially where there is a political sensitivity, where there is even technical sensitivity, because if the poverty data is collected for refugees, sometimes for nationals, there is a discrepancy in the way of measuring the poverty. So the indicators are different and everything is different. So it becomes more and more challenging. Though it is, in principle, the short answer is yes, we include, and also the percentage varies from one place to another. In some places, the percentage is 50-50. So 50% should be national. In other places, it is possible to focus more on refugees and to include some communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziad. Janet or Sabrina, would you also like to add to this?
Yes. Maybe in addition, what Ziad said is that in Ecuador we included Ecuadorians in the pilot. And this helped in this moment to strengthen the links to the governmental agencies. And for the scale up, we are not including Ecuadorians, but we are working with the government, with the Ministry of Inclusion and Economic, Social Inclusion and Economic. So we are working with them, and in this, so this open also the doors to begin in this to pass this capacity to them.
Just to reiterate, I think that's a nice sort of visualization or a nice example, really, of how those conversations with social protection actors can sometimes come about. Ecuador is not the only situation where we found that, having that experience with host communities really enables a conversation to start with some government actors to consider. Obviously, they're looking at the broader universe of social protection programs, and as the CGAP map at the beginning indicates, there are only more government programs coming online in various different countries as everybody's exploring how is it that we're going to most effectively target this population. So it absolutely can help those conversations begin and can help social protection actors to start to consider exactly what might this look like in our context.
Thank you. We have one more question from the web chat from Walter. To what extent is the progression linear? And here I'm thinking about some of the shocks that may affect the progress. So perhaps extrapolating a bit on the shocks that the participants do face. This question is for all three panelists.
I'm happy to jump in first. It's never linear, or very, very rarely linear. For a very few people, are they actually able to sort of get out of the gates quickly and progress. And it's also very difficult to predict who will excel and who will succeed with fewer challenges than others. It's not always the people who are most obvious in terms of their ability to move forward. But that is part of the strategy behind that. Is why we have a longer intervention. That is why that coaching component is there. It is designed as an acknowledgement that for very vulnerable households, those challenges exist on a weekly basis, especially at the beginning of the project as you're just trying to get a foothold. Somebody in the household gets sick, you're ejected from your housing, you lose some kind of benefit, etc. And so the coach is really there to try and not solve problems, but really to help the family to come to solutions and provide valuable resources and information for linking them to services that can be helpful, but also just to accompany them during those shocks. The expectation being that as the program progresses, their asset base grows, their skills and their confidence levels grow. Hopefully the frequency of those shocks and the resilience that the family starts to show increases over time.
Yes, maybe to add what Janet says. No. Maybe to add what Janet says is, I think that sure we find in the progress of the program some situations that can maybe, because each family has their time, has their own needs. Each family is a world. So the work with the family, the case management model that we are applying with the mentors, visiting the mentors each 15 days to see what their needs. So this support very, very, in a very important way to the family. And what we find situations as health situations, we have maybe protection issues, we have LGBT issues, and we have maybe youth at risk. So we find in these families what happened in a family in this condition and the effects of the displacement and all of this that maybe can be recruited, can be big. And what we do especially is also we work with referral, we have a referral network where we refer all the cases depending on the needs and depending on the situation.
Thank you, Sabrina. Any further thoughts from our panelists, as we unfortunately will have to quickly take a hard stop here because of time. Asking our panelists if they have any concluding thoughts before I hand it on to my colleague, Aude de Montesquieu.
Nothing to add on this question. I think it was all said by colleagues. There was a question from the chat also related to the socioeconomic and poverty data and whether we are doing something on that. Do you want me to answer this question?
Sure, please do.
Yeah, so definitely there is a lot of fronts to solve this issue. There is the long-term solution, which is to have poverty data embedded in the institutional data collection and registration systems of UNHCR, but this is long-term, it's challenging, it's gonna take time in order to do this incorporation, and also in emergencies and influx of refugees, it's not an easy thing to do. But there are also short-term and medium-term solutions. The World Bank now is going to apply a poverty analysis methodology in the countries where concessional funding will be given to governments. And this, the list is containing 13 countries of least developed countries. In addition to that, UNHCR and partners are doing some efforts in terms of targeting, and this is where the poverty data could be extracted. We have work that has been done with WFP on that. There is work that has been done with the World Bank on that. The problem that, in my opinion, the problem is that there are many ways to do poverty analysis. There's no one way. And the problem is that some ways are expensive and require a lot of resources, and some others are less expensive. So, in fact, the less expensive one are more quantitative rather than quantitative. So it's really it depends on the operation, it depends on the country, it depends on the refugee situation. And it's challenging, especially also there are challenges related to the alignment with the poverty line in the host country, and so on. So there is a lot of work that is being done, but still we have a lot of work coming, and we are directing resources towards having better poverty data. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziad.
Yes, Sabrina from Hyatt. Maybe at final thoughts, we can say that really until this moment, we have seen a positive impact in the families that were entering in the graduation approach, and we are not finalizing the process, and we see this impact now. And also, maybe we have some questions that we need to think about that we thought here in Ecuador with UNHCR is how we can further scale up 2017, 2018, how we can scale up that, how to further engage government in this program, and how we are working on this. The economic challenges, how to keep ensuring access to the wage employment and self-employment. and all related to documentation, the straightening of the systematization and the processes and the follow-up of the cases.
Thank you, Sabrina. Janet, any lasting thoughts?
One final comment, a big thank you to everybody for tuning in to this webinar. And as you can tell, this is a continuing and ongoing learning process. So we look forward to hearing from practitioners who are interested in learning more, practitioners who may have some experience in this regard and are interested in sharing their experiences, whether with refugees or not. One of the things we learn is that working with different populations teaches you things that can be helpful in other contexts. We have, as the slide shows, an upcoming graduation in urban context guide, which is coming out. We'll be happy to share with participants on the call. Anytime you develop a guide, you can guarantee that new experiences arise, and so not everything will be documented. We hope that's helpful. And please do let us know. HIAS, our lovely colleagues HIAS and UNHCR in Ecuador are offering, are willing to play host for an immersion visit in August. So if you're interested in seeing what graduation looks like in a refugee context, if you're interested in learning more, please do contact us and let us know of that interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you again to all the panelists. I will pass the baton on to my colleague, Aude de Montesquieu, who is the technical lead for the graduation initiative at CGAP. Aude, over to you.
As Ziad reminded us, the magnitude of the refugee problem is tremendous, and we read in the news constantly that this is the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and there's an urgency in particular of two things. One is to kind of bridge the humanitarian and development divide that Ziad referred to, and the second is developing more economic inclusion type of strategies, especially in the situations that UNHCR calls protracted or over 5 years of displacement. Graduation, as Janet reminded us, is one of the strategies that can be applied among another, there are other livelihood interventions that UNHCR is developing, and so are other NGOs. But it's a very promising intervention, and we're really excited to be learning from the 22 pilots that are going to be, have already started or are going to be implemented within the next 18 months. What I heard from the panelists today is that the early lessons on conducting graduation in the refugee context is first, really to build on what's already existing, make the most of what the humanitarian agencies or the NGOs or the host governments are already delivering, and then use the graduation approach as a way to kind of streamline or knit together what is already out there and make it more coherent, organize the intervention and knit together what's there and sequence it in a more coherent way. And then also interesting was the early experience around using employment instead of self-employment strategies, with all the benefits that formal employment, additional benefits that formal employment can bring, although as the comments in the chat suggested, employment is still, wage employment is still really limited in terms of experience to just a few sites. The other things I heard, just 3 comments from Trickle Up, is the importance of adapting the financial services to the legal constraints. That often the financial service providers cannot offer the full range of financial, or there are legal restrictions on offering financial services to this population. And then from HIAS, the importance of adding maybe some components onto the graduation approach specifically for this target population. For example, HIAS talked about the need to have legal counseling or psychosocial support for this population that had been through a lot of hardships and who might need extra psychosocial support on top of the case management. Just a few final words. As Janet said, this is really just the beginning of the discussion around adapting graduation to refugees. Since there are so many subtopics coming up in the graduation field, we're thinking of organizing clusters on specific topics. You know, 2 weeks ago we had a cluster on disability that got started, and right now we're thinking, well, let's have, you know, sub-conversations around graduation in refugee and internally displaced context. And so with your permission, we'll keep your names from this webinar and make sure that we continue to share and discuss among ourselves on the specific issue of graduation for refugees. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Aude, and thank you everyone for joining today. We will be sharing the recording and the PowerPoint. So please do send us any of your questions and at the email that was shared in the web chat. And you can also reach out to the panelists directly. Thank you again to all the panelists.